Okay, scholars, we're in week 7. This is the last framework that I'm going to introduce to you all before I start to introduce the different experiences from the primary groups of people that we focus on in ethnic studies. Decolonization is important for us to understand the processes of decolonization. So we have to understand the system of colonization. So that's what we're doing this week. You're responsible for 3 readings and to look at 4 videos, and I'm going to introduce you to types of colonization. Before I get into that, I want to first trouble how we think about the world map. So this is a classic rendering of the map that we all learned throughout our academic education. This, however, is not an accurate representation of the scale or size of the continents. In 1569, the great cartographer, cartographer is someone who produces maps, created the traditional map that we know. And he created it based on the cylindrical projection, the globe that we see. The new map was well suited for nautical navigation. Since every line on the sphere follows longitude and latitude, it's constant. It made for an easier nautical aviation. However, in order to create the cylindrical projection on the map, he had to enlarge the continents going up towards the pole. So what we get is the dominant Western societies as rendered much larger than what they are. So if you look at this particular graphic, you see that the darker blue is the actual size of these continents. The light blue is how much they've been enlarged or scaled up to accommodate the map. This in and of itself isn't a problem, but this particular imagery, the light blue section, the enlarged continents section, has been used as political rhetoric or propaganda. The term power of representation and representation of power sums up quite well how maps and the rise of the Western nation state system, and with that, empire and colonialism are linked. That's according to Marion Franklin. And politically, it has been an essential part of the propaganda about the domination and natural power of the global West, right? So when cartographers were creating maps, they needed to increase the detail to accommodate for the cylindrical size and formation of it, but also because they wanted to include more detailed information about roads, towns, cities, states, etc. However, European cartographers were not concerned with mapping Africa and South America in such great detail during that time. They didn't think that they had any value at that time. However, once they learn about the value of South America and Africa, then we see a shift in the rhetoric about domination and power and inherent and natural power. And we're using the map as a visual way to illustrate the dominance of Europe and the dominance of North America, when in fact they are both much smaller than how we understand them. So this is the true size of South Africa in reference to the other continents. You can see that several continents, Spain, Portugal, France, the United States, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, China, India, all fit within the continent of Africa. And you can see them here on this side as well. If you look at the United States, if you look at India and Europe, you can see how much smaller they are in comparison to how it is illustrated on a traditional map. So we see on this map, Africa is relatively small, when in fact, Africa is about this size on scale for the map. They've just they've scaled these nations up much larger. I also wanted to give you an example of South America as well. Maintains its size, but in reference to the scaling up of Western nations, we see a huge difference. I also want to give you all some actual true sizes of the other nations. So Africa is 11.73 million miles squared. South America is 6.888 million miles squared. All of the rest of them, except for Russia in reference to South America, everything else is significantly smaller than than South America and Africa. The United States is only 3.797 million square miles. So if you take a look at Africa, Africa is almost twice the size of any of the other countries or continents. Everything else is relatively small in comparison, and yet our maps have depicted them as superpowers, not just in their global reach, but in their actual size. And it is central to how they've propagandized imperialism and the growth of the West into the dark other, or into those spaces that are considered uncivilized or savage. This map I wanted to show you because it indicates all of the countries that at its height Europe colonized. So between 1492 and 1914, Europe colonized more than 80% of the entire world. Rationalizations for Europe's successful domination include industrialization in Europe, disease. They brought disease to these other spaces, killing off a large amount of the native populations, and therefore were able to find success. And then more recently, it's been theorized that the production and technology of gunpowder, which actually is produced and developed in India, but Europe comes to gain access to the technology and uses the technology to exact violence in these places. And they are recent, more contemporary colonial studies scholars are arguing that gunpowder, that should read powder. Gunpowder technology is the real reason that Europe found the kind of success that they found for colonizing. But I want you to pay attention to the fact that, most of the world has been touched by Europe's colonial power and Europe's colonial violence, either partially or full colonial control. Many of these spaces still are in some kind of colonial relationship to Europe through commonwealths, and there are still some colonies that exist. This slide shows the growth of the U.S. U.S. imperialism. 1773, the Union started with 13 states. By 1899, the United States had come into possession of valuable colonies, Cuba, Philippines, and Puerto Rico. And so it's an illustration of the growth of the United States. It's an illustration of the growth of U.S. wealth. It is a timeline for how the U.S. develops in its global reach. Okay, so I also wanted to introduce you to some types of colonialism. Colonialism is when a foreign power goes to another territory for the purpose of exploiting and appropriating its resources. Its resources can and does also include its people. There are many different kinds of colonialism. These are a few. The most common types that we talk about are settler colonialism and extractive colonialism. Settler colonialism is the migration of large groups of people from the colonial power. So, for example, Europeans going to colonize territories to build permanent settlements. So, Europeans coming to the United States are coming to the Americas and building permanent settlements. Settler colonizers maintain citizenship in their origin country. They develop imperialist governments and enact new governing legal, cultural, and educational systems. The second common type is extractive colonialism. They're not so much concerned with setting up permanent residence. They're more concerned with removing the raw materials from a territory, gold, beaver fur, buffalo hide, sandalwood, natural history specimens and artifacts for museums. It doesn't require settlement. It does require the use of the exploitation of labor, usually of colonized people. That brings me to exploitation colonialism requires fewer migrants from the home country, the use of force or control to exploit the land. So it's using the people to, by force, to exploit the land, its natural resources, its raw material, and the labor of the people. Internal colonialism is a very, very commonly practiced, understood colonialism here in the United States. It's racial and ethnic oppression and exploitation by the dominant power in the same country. It is enabled by psychological colonialism, which uses institutionalized axiology, ontology, and epistemology to shape people's individual concepts of what is right, true, just, and desirable. The U.S. starts off as both a settler colony and a plantation colony. It's an early method where settlers focus on mass production of a single crop, cotton, tobacco, coffee, sugar, and imposes religion and Western culture on indigenous people. Surrogate colonialism is when a foreign power encourages or supports non-native groups to take over an indigenous population through diplomacy, financial support, humanitarian materials, and arms. The United States also participates in this. Oftentimes, we will arm and fund a rebellion or a revolution or a takeover where one will fund one group in order for them to take over power in another group. If you pay attention to our movements in funding in Iraq and Iran, which resulted in the Desert Storm war, a lot of it had to do with our involvement in funding the different factions at different times. Trade colonialism is colonialist ventures in support of trade opportunities for merchants, forced opening of ports to Western powers. So this happened in Africa, the Congo, the Niger River, all become spaces for ports for Western power. This also happens in India, in the early stages of colonialism in India. And then we have neocolonialism. This term is coined by Jean-Paul Sartre in 1956. It describes a new colonialism. It is the continuation of the reimposition of imperialist rule over so-called independent states through economic, political, cultural, etc., control and influence. Neocolonialism is a part of what decolonial scholars and activists are trying to combat. So even though spaces were gained independence from colonial powers, there's still a great deal of colonial influence in those places through the economy, through politics, and through culture, through what we value, how we value, what we know, and how we know it. Okay, so that's our lesson on the quick introduction that I wanted to give you on the types of colonialism and to kind of show you the extent to which colonial rule has plagued us globally. So I'll stop this video here, and then we'll start the next video about the Berlin conference.